A poor boy saved a millionaire's daughter from a fire. When asked how he wanted to repay him, his answer left the millionaire speechless. The dim light of the Boston morning filtered through the lace curtains of a modest, weathered home nestled in a quiet corner of the city. The wooden floor creaked softly under Terry's small, purposeful steps as he shrugged on his too-thin jacket. He was 10, but the weight of his routine lent him a gravity uncommon for boys his age. His shoes, scuffed and too large, slapped lightly against the floorboards as he grabbed his burlap sack, ready to start his morning. From the kitchen, the faint clinking of a spoon against a chipped porcelain cup drifted into the small living room. Susan, his grandmother, sat at the round table, her back straight, despite the years etched into her bones. Her hands, rough from years of sewing and mending, cradled a steaming mug of tea. Her sharp eyes followed Terry as he adjusted the sack over his shoulder. "You've got gloves in the basket by the door," she said, her voice low but firm. She didn't look up from the spool of thread she was winding, but the words were edged with concern. "I'll be fine, Grandma," Terry replied, though he hesitated by the door. His hand hovered over the basket before pulling on the oversized gloves with a resigned shrug. Susan's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Fine doesn't mean warm. Get a scarf too. It's colder today." Terry sighed theatrically, but obeyed, wrapping a frayed scarf around his neck. The scarf had once been blue, but had faded to a pale, threadbare gray. "There. Happy?" "Delighted," she said, a flicker of humor softening her voice. "Be back before lunch." With a quick nod, Terry pushed the door open, letting in a crisp gust of air that made the curtains flutter. The cold bit his cheeks as he stepped outside, but he didn't mind. The streets were quieter at this hour, save for the distant rumble of delivery trucks and the occasional bark of a dog. The neighborhood bore the weight of its age. Brick facades, dulled by decades of soot and salt, lined the narrow streets. Each stoop held a story. A rusted bike leaned against a railing. A forgotten pair of shoes sat neatly by a doorway. Terry knew these streets well. He'd walked them countless times, eyes scanning for discarded cans, bottles, and anything else that could be sold to the scrapyard. He turned a corner, pausing by a dumpster behind a bakery. The air carried a faint sweetness from the night's baking, and Terry's stomach grumbled. He brushed the thought aside, leaning into the dumpster's shadow to search for recyclables. Back at the house, Susan hummed under her breath as she worked. The sewing machine whirred softly, the needle darting through fabric like a dancer's quick steps. A patch of sunlight crept across the floor, warming the room despite the chill outside. On the table beside her lay a pile of neatly folded clothes awaiting delivery, each piece carefully mended with precision that belied her tired eyes. When the door creaked open a few hours later, Susan looked up. Terry entered, cheeks flushed and sack noticeably fuller. He set it down gently, brushing his hands together to rid them of the faint grime. "Found a good spot," he said simply, pride flickering in his voice. "Looks like it," Susan replied, glancing at the sack. She reached for a kettle, pouring steaming water into a chipped mug. "Sit. Tea's ready." Terry obeyed, the chair creaking under his slight weight. He accepted the mug with both hands, the warmth seeping into his fingers. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the quiet punctuated by the occasional sip of tea or rustle of fabric. "You're looking tired," Susan said finally, her tone light but probing. "You slept, didn't you?" "Enough," Terry said, his gaze fixed on the mug. He quickly changed the subject. "Mrs. Whitaker on Market Street said she might have some old pots and pans tomorrow. Worth checking." Susan's lips pressed into a thin line, but she let it go. "Could be. You have a keen sense of what is worthwhile." The corners of Terry's mouth twitched upward, a rare smile breaking through his usual seriousness. "You taught me well." Susan chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Someone's got to." Can't have you walking around aimlessly." The afternoon sun slanted through the window, casting long shadows on the walls. In this small, worn home, life moved quietly, steadily, shaped by routines and resilience. As Terry washed his mug and prepared for his next chore, Susan watched him, her sharp eyes softening. They didn't speak of their hardships, but the weight of them hung in the air like an unspoken agreement. Together, they carried that weight, their love woven into every shared moment. For now, it was enough. The Shelton estate stood like a sentinel at the edge of the Boston suburbs, its expansive grounds hemmed in by towering wrought-iron gates. Beyond the gates, a winding driveway curved through manicured lawns, past fountains whose water glinted in the afternoon sun, and up to the grand stone mansion. The air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass and roses, the kind of scent that only seemed to belong to places where wealth kept the world perfectly in order. Inside, the mansion buzzed with activity. Staff moved with practiced efficiency, their voices low as they polished, arranged, and prepared for the evening's celebration. It was the anniversary of Shelton Enterprises, and Ronald Shelton, the man at the helm, was overseeing the final details from his study. The room, lined with shelves of leather-bound books and heavy with the scent of aged wood, mirrored its owner, structured, purposeful, and quietly imposing. Ronald stood by the window, his sharp features softened by the afternoon light. A crystal tumbler rested in his hand, the amber liquid inside untouched. His eyes flicked between his watch and the driveway below, where catering trucks arrived in succession. The rhythmic efficiency pleased him. It reflected the life he had built, one of precision and control. "Mr. Shelton," a voice interrupted. It was Harris, his butler, standing in the doorway with the usual air of calm deference. "The caterers have confirmed the menu, and the orchestra is setting up in the garden." Ronald gave a curt nod. "Good. Everything needs to run smoothly tonight." He hesitated for a moment. "Have you seen Pamela?" "Miss Pamela was in the library earlier, sir. She mentioned exploring the house afterward." Ronald's mouth tightened briefly. "Remind her to stay out of the West Wing. It's still under maintenance." "Of course, sir." Harris inclined his head and left. Pamela had grown accustomed to being unnoticed in her father's meticulously ordered world. At 8 years old, she'd learned how to navigate the large house without interrupting its rhythm. Her favorite spot was the library, where the shelves seemed to stretch to the ceiling and the heavy curtains muted the constant hum of activity outside. But even the library, with its comforting quiet, couldn't hold her attention today. Dressed in a pale blue dress that matched her ribboned ballet flats, she wandered through the long hallways, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs. She passed rooms she had seen 100 times, parlors with gilded mirrors, guest rooms kept pristine but unused, a music room with a gleaming piano no one played. The West Wing intrigued her precisely because it was forbidden. Her father rarely mentioned it except in passing, but she knew it was where the old kitchen and staff quarters were, left untouched since the estate had been remodeled. The idea of a place forgotten in such a grand house tugged at her curiosity. When she reached the doorway to the West Wing, Pamela hesitated. The air here felt cooler, heavier. The polished wood floors gave way to scuffed linoleum, and the light dimmed as the tall windows gave way to smaller, dustier panes. She stepped inside, her small hand brushing the wall to steady herself as her eyes adjusted to the change. The smell was different, faintly metallic, with a trace of something damp. She passed an old storage room filled with stacked chairs and dusty linens, her fingers trailing over a banister with peeling paint. The corridor stretched further than she expected, leading to a wide kitchen at the end. The room was cavernous, its tiled walls stark under the pale light from a single high window. A massive iron stove stood against one wall, its surface covered in a fine layer of ash. Pamela stepped closer to the stove, the soft click of her shoes echoing in the empty space. She crouched to examine the ash, her small fingers brushing against it before she quickly pulled them back. She felt a shiver run up her spine, not sure if it was the chill or the quiet unease that seemed to linger in the air. She looked up, spotting a stack of old recipe books on a counter nearby. The leather bindings were cracked, and the edges of the pages curled with age. As she reached for one, the sound of a distant door creaking made her freeze. For a moment, she thought someone had followed her, but the sound didn't come again. She placed the book back, careful not to disturb the thin layer of dust that blanketed it. Meanwhile, back in the main house, Ronald glanced at his watch again, irritation flickering across his face. He stood abruptly, leaving his untouched drink on the windowsill, and headed toward the foyer. The thought of his daughter wandering aimlessly unsettled him, though he couldn't have said why. Pamela, however, had already left the West Wing, her steps light as she returned to the familiarity of the bustling halls. She didn't look back, though the weight of the quiet kitchen lingered with her, like a whisper she couldn't quite make out. At the Shelton estate, the evening unfolded like a rehearsed symphony. Staff flitted between the garden and the grand ballroom, carrying trays of sparkling champagne and arranging last-minute details for the company's anniversary celebration. The air hummed with conversation, laughter, and the distant notes of a string quartet. Amidst the festivities, Pamela moved quietly, unnoticed as she often was. The lively energy of the party didn't excite her. She preferred the quieter corners of the house. But tonight, something gnawed at her. She touched the side of her head, realizing her favorite ribboned hair clip, the one her mother had given her, was missing. Her heart sank. She knew exactly where she had left it. The kitchen in the West Wing, the very place her father had forbidden her to explore. Pamela hesitated. She glanced around the crowded room, spotting her father, engrossed in a conversation with the board members. Her grandmother, Christina, was busy entertaining guests near the orchestra. No one would notice if she slipped away. Without further hesitation, she pivoted and made her way towards the West Wing. Terry crouched beside a dumpster just beyond the estate gates, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows for anything of value. The rhythmic hum of the party spilled faintly into the night air, a distant contrast to the quiet resolve of his work. The sack over his shoulder grew heavier with each find, but he barely noticed. He straightened, brushing dirt from his hands, when a flicker of orange light caught his attention. He turned toward the estate and froze. The West Wing, its darkened windows normally invisible behind the grandeur of the main house, was now alive with a flickering glow. Smoke curled into the night sky, thin and unassuming at first, then darker, heavier. Terry stood motionless for a moment, the realization sweeping over him like a wave. The building was on fire. Instinct kicked in. He dropped his sack, the clatter of cans and bottles echoing briefly in the alley. Without hesitation, he darted toward the estate, slipping through a gap in the gates and racing toward the growing blaze. Pamela was already inside when the smell of smoke reached her. She paused in the middle of the kitchen, her fingers clutching the cool metal of her hair clip. The faint, metallic tang in the air had shifted into something sharper, more acrid. The light overhead flickered. Her small chest tightened as the first tendrils of panic took hold. She turned toward the hallway, but her path back was already blurred by a creeping haze of grey. The fire was spreading faster than she could have imagined. "Daddy!" she called, her voice breaking. "Grandma!" The walls seemed to close in around her. Heat radiated through the floor beneath her feet, and the smoke thickened, stinging her eyes and throat. She stumbled back toward the stove, her small hands gripping its edge as she coughed, desperate for air. Terry reached the West Wing, his chest heaving as he scanned the scene. Flames licked at the wooden beams above the kitchen, the fire growing with a feral intensity. Through the smoke-filled window, he caught a glimpse of movement, a small figure silhouetted against the firelight. His heart pounded. It was a girl. "Hey!" he shouted, though he doubted she could hear him. Wasting no time, he pulled at the window frame, his fingers scraping against splinters and soot. The glass had cracked but held firm. He grabbed a nearby rock and smashed it with all his strength. The shards fell inward with a sharp crash. "Over here!" he yelled, leaning through the opening. "Come to the window!" Pamela turned, her tear-streaked face pale and streaked with soot. Fear gripped her, causing her to hesitate. "I'll help you," Terry called again. "Come on." The desperation in his voice broke through her terror. She stumbled forward, coughing, her small hands reaching for his outstretched arms. Terry pulled her up and through the narrow frame, his shoulders screaming in protest as he lifted her. The heat from the fire clawed at his back, but he didn't stop. Pamela's hands clung tightly to his neck as he carried her down the short distance to the lawn. His steps faltered as the smoke filled his lungs, but he pressed on, staggering toward the cool night air. As they reached the edge of the lawn, Pamela slid from his arms, collapsing onto the grass, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Terry managed a weak smile before the ground seemed to tilt beneath him. His knees buckled, and he crumpled beside her, his vision swimming in black. From the garden, the guests had begun to notice the fire. A ripple of alarm spread through the crowd as Ronald turned, his face paling at the sight of the smoke billowing from the west wing. "Pamela!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. He broke into a sprint, Christina following close behind, their hearts pounding with dread. They reached the lawn to find Pamela kneeling beside an unconscious boy, her small hands shaking as she tried to rouse him. "Daddy!" she cried, her voice trembling. "He saved me!" Ronald dropped to his knees beside them, his hand instinctively checking the boy's pulse. It was faint, but steady. Relief warred with the panic still surging through him. "Get help!" he barked to the nearby staff. As the first responders approached, Pamela clung to her father, her small body shaking as tears streamed down her soot-streaked face. "He saved me," she whispered again, her voice cracking. Ronald's gaze fell on the boy, his chest tightening with gratitude and awe. The night's celebration was forgotten, only this moment remained. As Terry was lifted onto the stretcher, Ronald looked down at the boy who had risked everything to save his daughter. The flames still roared behind them, but all he could think of was the debt he now owed this brave child. The evening shadows deepened over the quiet neighborhood as Susan glanced at the clock on the wall for what felt like the 100th time. The steaming pot of stew on the stove filled the small kitchen with warmth, but her heart grew colder with each passing minute. Terry should have been home by now. She wiped her hands on her worn apron and stepped out onto the front porch, peering down the dimly lit street. The familiar rustle of trees and the chatter of distant neighbors did little to ease her nerves. Wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders, she decided to look for him. Susan stopped by the corner where Terry's friends often gathered. "Have you seen Terry?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with urgency. One of the boys, perched on an old crate, scratched his head. "He said he was heading to the rich folks' area to look for bottles," he replied, pointing toward the direction of the grand estates. Susan's chest tightened. She nodded her thanks and quickened her pace, her worn shoes clicking against the pavement. As she approached the edge of the neighborhood, something caught her eye. Thick, dark smoke, curling into the sky from beyond the high gates of the wealthier district. Her steps faltered. The smoke rose heavier and darker, twisting ominously against the fading light. A chill ran down her spine, her mind racing with unspoken fears. "Oh no," she whispered. The sterile white walls of the hospital waiting room were a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just hours earlier. The faint hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence, broken only by the occasional shuffle of nurses' shoes and the steady beep of distant monitors. Ronald Shelton sat stiffly in a plastic chair, his usually composed demeanor betrayed by the tension in his jaw. Beside him, Pamela sat curled in the oversized hospital chair, her small frame wrapped in a scratchy grey blanket. "Is he going to be okay?" Pamela's voice broke the quiet, trembling with the uncertainty of a child who had seen too much. Ronald hesitated, his gaze fixed on the swinging doors that led to the emergency ward. "He's strong," he replied finally, his voice low but steady. "He'll pull through." He wasn't sure if he was trying to reassure her or himself. Pamela clutched the blanket tighter, her fingers twisting the edge. "Daddy, he didn't even know me. Why did he do it?" Ronald turned to his daughter, his expression softening for the first time in that evening. "Because some people don't need a reason to do the right thing," he said. "They just act." Before Pamela could respond, the doors swung open. A doctor stepped into the room, his scrubs wrinkled, but his expression calm. "Mr. Shelton." Ronald stood immediately, his heart pounding. "How is he?" The doctor offered a small, reassuring smile. "He's stable. The smoke inhalation was significant, and he's got some minor burns and a dislocated shoulder. But he's awake. He's asking for water, actually." Ronald let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Can we see him?" The doctor nodded. "Just one at a time for now. He's still very weak." Ronald looked at Pamela, who nodded earnestly. "Go," she urged. "I'll wait here." The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, and the only light came from a dim lamp beside the bed. Terry lay propped up against a stack of pillows, his face pale beneath the bandages on his forehead. His small frame seemed even smaller against the expanse of the hospital bed, but his eyes were open, their dark depths steady despite the pain etched into his features. "Hi there," Ronald said gently as he stepped inside, his voice quieter than usual. He approached the bed cautiously, as though afraid to disturb the fragile peace in the room. Terry's gaze flicked toward him, recognition sparking. "Is she okay?" he croaked, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "Pamela's fine," Ronald assured him, pulling a chair closer to the bed. "Thanks to you. And your name is?" Terry's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "Terry." Ronald leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I'm Ronald. I want to help you too. Whatever you need, a reward, medical bills, anything, name it." Terry's eyes flickered with surprise, but he quickly looked away, staring at the blank wall across the room. "I don't want money," he said quietly. Ronald frowned, confused. "Then what? Anything you ask for, name it, and it's yours." Terry hesitated, his small hand fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. I want to go to school." Ronald tilted his head, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "School?" The boy nodded, his gaze still fixed on the wall. "Want to go to school? Learn things? Get better? So my grandma doesn't have to work so hard?" The room fell silent, the weight of the words settling over them. Ronald stared at him, astonished. "That's it?" he asked, his voice almost incredulous. "You saved my daughter, and all you want is to go to school?" Terry nodded, his eyes unwavering. "Yes." Ronald sat back, a mix of admiration and shame washing over him. He had expected greed, a demand for wealth or status, something transactional. Instead, this boy, this child who had faced death to save another, asked for something so fundamental, so pure. It left him speechless. "You'll have it," Ronald said finally, his voice firm. I'll make sure of it. Terry nodded, the faintest hint of relief crossing his face before his eyes closed again, exhaustion pulling him back into sleep. Ronald stepped out of the room to find Pamela waiting anxiously. She jumped up as soon as she saw him. "Can I see him now?" Ronald nodded, crouching to her level. "You can. He's awake, but he's tired. Be gentle, okay?" Pamela nodded, determination shining in her tear-streaked face. As she disappeared into the room, Ronald leaned against the wall, his thoughts swirling. He had entered the hospital with the intention of repaying a debt. But he now realized Terry hadn't just saved his daughter. He had given Ronald a lesson in humility and humanity. This boy, with nothing to his name, had more strength and grace than Ronald could ever have imagined. And Ronald, for the first time in years, felt a stirring of something unfamiliar. Hope. The drive to Terry's home was silent, save for the occasional hum of the car's engine. Ronald glanced at the boy in the rearview mirror. Terry sat quietly, his small frame swaddled in the oversized hospital blanket. His eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but his grip on the seatbelt was firm, as if grounding himself in the unfamiliar luxury of the vehicle. Pamela sat beside Terry, her usual chatter subdued. She fiddled with the edges of her borrowed blanket, stealing glances at him every few seconds. Ronald could see the admiration in her eyes, a childlike awe directed toward the boy who had braved the fire to save her. "Are you sure she's home?" Ronald asked, breaking the silence. Terry nodded, his voice hoarse but steady. "She'll be waiting." The house was small and plain, nestled at the edge of a quiet neighborhood. The paint on the shutters had long since peeled, and the garden was overgrown, though a faint warmth emanated from its worn facade. Ronald parked the car, stepping out as Terry slowly slid down from the seat, his movements deliberate. The front door creaked open before they reached it. Susan stood in the doorway, her face a mixture of relief and anxiety. Her eyes immediately found Terry, and she let out a soft cry, rushing forward. "Terry!" she exclaimed, pulling him into her arms. Her hands fluttered over him, checking for injuries despite the bandages already covering him. "What happened? Are you all right? I was so worried." "I'm okay, Grandma," Terry murmured, leaning into her embrace. "I'm okay." Susan's gaze lifted to Ronald and Pamela, her brows furrowing slightly. "And you are?" "I'm Ronald Shelton," he said, extending a hand, "and this is my daughter, Pamela. Terry saved her life last night." Susan's hand paused mid-air before she shook his, her grip firm but hesitant. "Saved her?" she echoed, glancing down at Terry, who stood quietly at her side. "He risked his life," Ronald continued, his voice softening. "He went into a burning building to get her out." Susan's face paled, her eyes darting back to Terry. "Oh, Terry, I couldn't leave her," he said simply, his tone matter of fact. "She needed help." Tears welled in Susan's eyes, but she blinked them away. "You're too brave for your own good," she muttered, her voice trembling. She turned back to Ronald. "Thank you for bringing him home." "It's the least I could do," Ronald replied, "and I'd like to do more." Susan's expression shifted slightly, wary. "More?" "Terry mentioned he wants to go to school," Ronald said, crouching slightly to meet her gaze. "I want to make sure he can." Susan's lips parted in surprise. "School? I'm okay." Susan's gaze lifted to Ronald and Pamela, her brows furrowing slightly. "And you are?" "I'm Ronald Shelton," he said, extending a hand. "And this is my daughter, Pamela. Terry saved her life last night." Susan's hand paused mid-air before she shook his, her grip firm but hesitant. "Saved her?" she echoed, glancing down at Terry, who stood quietly at her side. "He risked his life," Ronald continued, his voice softening. He went into a burning building to get her out. Susan's face paled, her eyes darting back to Terry. "Oh, Terry, I couldn't leave her," he said simply, his tone matter-of-fact. "She needed help." Tears welled in Susan's eyes, but she blinked them away. "You're too brave for your own good," she muttered, her voice trembling. She turned back to Ronald. "Thank you for bringing him home." "It's the least I could do," Ronald replied, "and I'd like to do more." Susan's expression shifted slightly, wary. "More?" "Terry mentioned he wants to go to school," Ronald said, crouching slightly to meet her gaze. "I want to make sure he can." Susan's lips parted in surprise. "School? I'm okay." Susan's gaze lifted to Ronald and Pamela, her brows furrowing slightly. "And you are?" "I'm Ronald Shelton," he said, extending a hand, "and this is my daughter Pamela. Terry saved her life last night." Susan's hand paused mid-air before she shook his, her grip firm but hesitant. "Saved her?" she echoed, glancing down at Terry, who stood quietly at her side. "He risked his life," Ronald continued, his voice softening. "He went into a burning building to get her out." Susan's face paled, her eyes darting back to Terry. "Oh, Terry, I couldn't leave her," he said simply, his tone matter-of-fact. "She needed help." Tears welled in Susan's eyes, but she blinked them away. "You're too brave for your own good," she muttered, her voice trembling. She turned back to Ronald. "Thank you for bringing him home." "It's the least I could do," Ronald replied, "and I'd like to do more." Susan's expression shifted slightly, wary. "More?" "Terry mentioned he wants to go to school," Ronald said, crouching slightly to meet her gaze. "I want to make sure he can." Susan's lips parted in surprise. "School?" Terry glanced at her, a shy smile tugging at his lips. "Grandma taught me," he replied. "She's been helping me since I was little." Pamela hesitated before speaking again, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. "I miss my mum," she said softly. "She used to help me with my homework too." Terry looked up, his gaze steady despite the faint sadness in his eyes. "I miss mine too," he said simply. "She passed away when I was little." The quiet acknowledgement hung between them, heavy but unspoken. For a moment they sat in silence, each lost in their own memories. Then Pamela smiled faintly. "It's nice, having someone to do this with." Terry nodded, his voice quiet but certain. "Yeah, it is." Later that week, Ronald took both children to the park, a promise he had made to Pamela after the tumultuous events of the past days. Can you guess what happens next in the story? Let's play a little game. Follow this story until the end, and remember this challenge. If the story goes according to your prediction, leave a comment, cherry, below. Guess who the prophet will be? The park was alive with energy, as families sprawled on blankets and children darted between swings and slides. The smell of freshly cut grass mingled with the faint aroma of hot dogs from a vendor near the entrance. A breeze rustled the trees, carrying laughter through the open air. Ronald parked the car near the edge of the playground and stepped out, gesturing for Terry and Pamela to follow. Terry hesitated, his gaze sweeping across the expanse of the park. It was a world removed from his usual haunts, vibrant and carefree. "Go on," Ronald said, his tone encouraging. "You deserve a break." Pamela grabbed Terry's hand, her energy contagious. "Come on, I'll show you the swings." She tugged him forward before he could protest. Terry glanced back at Ronald, who gave him a small nod. Reluctantly, he let Pamela lead the way. Pamela and Terry reached the swings first. Pamela climbed onto one and gestured for Terry to take the other. "Do you know how to swing?" she asked, already pumping her legs to gain height. Terry shook his head, eyeing the seat warily. "Not really," Pamela laughed. It's easy. I'll show you. With her encouragement, Terry sat down and mimicked her movements. His swings started awkwardly, but soon he was soaring beside her. The wind tugged at his hair, and for a moment he forgot everything. His injuries, the weight of responsibility, the fire. Laughter escaped him, surprising even himself. "You're a natural," Pamela shouted, grinning. Ronald watched from a bench nearby, his arms resting on the backrest. He'd seen Pamela laugh before, but this was different, freer, less guarded. His daughter's joy radiated as she shared the moment with Terry, who looked lighter than he had since Ronald had met him. "You're good with her," Ronald called when the two children ran back to him, cheeks flushed. Terry shrugged, ducking his head. "She's nice," Terry mumbled, his voice barely audible. Pamela rolled her eyes dramatically. "Of course I'm nice. Now come on, we're playing tag." Terry barely had time to react before Pamela tapped his shoulder and ran off, giggling. Ronald chuckled as Terry hesitated, then gave chase. The boy's movements were cautious at first, but soon he was fully immersed in the game, his laughter mingling with Pamela's. An hour passed before the children finally collapsed onto the grass, breathless and flushed. Ronald walked over, handing each of them a bottle of water. "You two are a handful," he said with a mock sigh. Pamela grinned. "We're fun, Daddy. Admit it." Ronald smiled, watching as Terry gulped down the water. The boy's guarded demeanor had softened, and Ronald saw glimpses of the child he was meant to be, playful, carefree, and full of life. "You having fun, Terry?" Ronald asked. Terry nodded, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Yeah, it's nice here." Pamela chimed in. "We should come back tomorrow." Ronald's gaze flicked to Terry, who looked at Pamela with something between wonder and disbelief. He knew such invitations were rare for the boy, and Pamela's easy inclusion of him seemed to touch a part of Terry that words couldn't reach. "We'll see," Ronald said, his tone warm. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Ronald glanced at the time. "We should head back," he said. "I promised your grandmother I'd have you home before dinner." Terry nodded, his brief spell of freedom grounding itself as reality crept back in. Pamela, sensing his change in mood, leaned over. "Next time I'll show you the big slides. They're amazing." Terry managed a small smile. "Okay." Ronald watched the exchange, pride swelling in his chest. The bond forming between the two children was unexpected, but beautiful. A reminder of how simple connections could bridge even the widest gaps. As they walked back to the car, Ronald noticed Terry glance at the families in the park. Parents holding hands, children laughing, and couples strolling. There was a quiet longing in his expression that Ronald couldn't ignore. "We'll do this again," Ronald said, resting a hand on Terry's shoulder. Terry looked up at him, surprised, but grateful. "Thank you," he said softly. Ronald gave him a firm nod, his thoughts lingering on the boy's resilience. And as they drove back, Ronald couldn't shake the feeling that this day was the start of something far greater than a simple outing. Something that tied Terry and his family's fate closer to his own. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as Ronald and Christina sat in the grand dining room of the Shelton estate. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting soft shadows across the polished mahogany table. Christina sat with her back straight, her hands cradling a porcelain teacup, watching her son with curious eyes. "You want to do what?" she asked, her tone skeptical, but not dismissive. "I want to invite Terry and his grandmother over for dinner," Ronald repeated, leaning forward slightly. "A proper meal? Here." Christina raised an eyebrow. "At the West Wing?" "Yes," Ronald said. "The renovations are finished, and it's the least we can do after what that boy did. He saved Pamela's life, Mother." Christina sighed softly, placing her teacup down on its saucer with a faint clink. "I'm not saying it's a bad idea, Ronald, But have you considered how they might feel? It's a big gesture. They might find it overwhelming. That's why Pamela and I will talk to them, Ronald said firmly. We'll make sure they know it's just a gesture of gratitude, not an obligation. Pamela, who had been quietly listening at the far end of the room, spoke up. Terry won't mind. He's not like that. Christina smiled faintly at her granddaughter's conviction. And his grandmother. Have you met her? I have, Ronald said, leaning back. She's strong, proud, but she's also deeply grateful for what we've done for Terry. I think she'll accept if we're thoughtful about how we ask. Christina tapped her fingers lightly against the table, her expression softening. Well, if you're determined, I won't argue. Just make it welcoming. No grand displays. Ronald nodded, a hint of relief in his eyes. I'll keep it simple. At a small house on the outskirts of the city, Terry sat at the kitchen table, scribbling answers into his workbook, while Susan kneaded dough at the counter. The air was warm, with the smell of rising bread, and the faint hum of the radio played in the background. Terry, Susan said, glancing over her shoulder, do you think you'll need more pencils soon? I can pick some up when I go to the market. I still have a few, Terry replied, not looking up from his work. Thanks, Grandma. The knock on the door interrupted their quiet routine. Susan wiped her hands on her apron and moved to answer it. She opened the door to find Ronald and Pamela standing on the porch, the former holding a basket of fruit. Mr. Shelton, Susan said, surprised. Pamela. Good evening, Mrs. Susan, Ronald said with a polite nod. I hope we're not interrupting. Not at all, Susan said, stepping aside to let them in. Please, come in. Ronald and Pamela entered the small kitchen, the space feeling even smaller with the addition of 2 guests. Pamela smiled brightly at Terry, who straightened in his chair, his surprise evident. We wanted to thank you both properly, Ronald began, his tone measured. Pamela and I were wondering if you'd join us for dinner tomorrow evening. At our home. Susan blinked, her hands twisting in her apron. Dinner? She echoed. At your house? Yes, Ronald said gently. It's just a meal, a way for us to express our gratitude. Nothing more. Pamela chimed in. We really want you to come. Terry can meet my grandma too. She's nice, I promise. Susan hesitated, glancing at Terry, who was looking at her with wide, hopeful eyes. I don't know, she began, her voice uncertain. I wouldn't want to impose. You wouldn't be, Ronald assured her. It's the least we can do. Terry tugged at her sleeve. Please, Grandma, he asked softly. Susan exhaled, her resolve wavering under her grandson's pleading gaze. Finally, she nodded. All right, we'll come. The next evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Susan and Terry stood before the towering gates of the Shelton estate. Susan clutched a small box of neatly arranged pastries in her hands, her heart pounding in her chest. Terry, dressed in his best shirt, looked up at her, his expression filled with excitement. Ready, Grandma? He asked, his voice steady, despite her visible nerves. Susan swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the grand house beyond the gates. Memory stirred, old and unwelcome, like whispers from another life. She tightened her grip on the pastry box, willing herself to stay composed. Yes, she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. Let's go. The gates creaked open, and they stepped inside, the air around them heavy with unspoken emotions. For Susan, the Shelton estate was not just a grand house. It was a portal to a past she had tried to leave behind. The heavy wooden doors of the Shelton estate creaked open, revealing a grand foyer bathed in the warm glow of a chandelier. Terry's eyes widened as he stepped inside, his gaze darting to the marble floors, the tall arched windows, and the ornate staircase that spiraled upward. Pamela appeared at the top of the staircase, her face lighting up the moment she spotted him. "Terry!" she called, bounding down the steps with the unbridled enthusiasm only children could muster. She reached his side in seconds, grabbing his hand and pulling him toward the sitting room. "Come on, I want to show you the piano, it's huge." "Pamela," Ronald's calm voice interrupted, though it held a note of amusement. "Let's save the tour for after dinner." Pamela pouted for a brief moment before grinning again. "Okay, but he has to sit next to me," she declared, tugging Terry toward the dining room. Ronald stepped forward, smiling warmly at Susan. "Please, Mrs. Susan, right this way. We've prepared everything in the West Wing." Susan followed hesitantly, her hands gripping her shawl tightly. She glanced around the grand hall as they walked, her memories of the house slowly resurfacing with each step. They entered the dining room, where the table was set with gleaming silverware and fine china. A modest but elegant arrangement of white lilies adorned the center, their delicate fragrance filling the air. Susan's breath hitched slightly at the sight, the careful preparation making her feel both welcomed and out of place. "Ah, you've arrived." A soft, refined voice spoke from the staircase behind them. Susan turned and froze. Christina Shelton descended the stairs with poise, her regal bearing making her seem taller than she was. Their eyes met, and a faint tremor ran through Susan's frame. For a moment, neither woman spoke, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. "Welcome," Christina greeted with a polite smile, though her sharp eyes lingered on her face as if trying to place her. Susan managed a nod, her voice barely audible as she replied, "Thank you." Her grip on her shawl tightened as the weight of the past began to press against her chest. The dining room of the Shelton estate exuded a subtle elegance. The long mahogany table gleamed under the light of the chandelier, its surface adorned with a simple centerpiece of white roses and flickering candles. The newly renovated West Wing exuded warmth, its neutral tones and soft lighting inviting rather than imposing. Yet for Susan, the grandeur was suffocating. She sat stiffly beside Terry, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she observed the room with quiet unease. Across from her, Pamela chattered happily with Terry, their youthful voices weaving a thread of lightness through the tension she couldn't seem to shake. Christina Shelton, seated at the head of the table, studied Susan discreetly. Something familiar about the woman hovered just out of reach, like a word on the edge of Christina's tongue. Christina's sharp eyes lingered on Susan's face, her poised demeanor betraying a flicker of curiosity. Ronald, ever the diplomat, broke the silence that had settled over the adults. "Susan, I hope the meal is to your liking. The chef prepared it with great care." "It's lovely," Susan replied, her voice polite but restrained. She picked at her plate, the food tasting like ash in her mouth. Pamela interrupted, her tone bright. "Grandma, Terry's really good at spelling. We worked on his homework at the library, and he helped me with my math too." "That's wonderful, Pamela," Christina said, her smile softening as she turned her attention to Terry. "It seems we have a scholar in the making." Terry ducked his head, his cheeks reddening. "Grandma taught me," he said quietly. "She's really good at helping me learn." Susan's heart swelled with pride, but the moment was short-lived. Christina's gaze returned to her, more focused now, as if Terry's words had resonated with her. "You're remarkable, Susan," Christina said suddenly. "Raising such a bright and kind boy. It can't have been easy." Susan looked up, startled by the sincerity in her voice. "It hasn't," she admitted cautiously. "But Terry makes it worthwhile." Christina nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And you've been in Boston long?" Susan hesitated, her grip on her fork tightening. "A long time," she said carefully, "mostly keeping to ourselves." Christina's eyes narrowed slightly, her fingers tapping lightly against the table. "I see." As the evening wore on, The conversation grew lighter, with Pamela and Terry providing most of the energy. Ronald listened with quiet pride, occasionally chiming in with encouragement or a light-hearted remark. But Susan's unease grew with each passing moment, her senses acutely aware of Christina's watchful gaze. When dessert was served, a delicate lemon tart topped with sugared berries, Christina leaned forward slightly. "Susan," she said, her tone casual, but her words pointed. "You seem familiar to me. Have we met before?" The question hovered in the air, the light chatter from the children fading into the background. Susan's heart thudded painfully in her chest, and for a moment, she couldn't find her voice. I don't believe so," she said finally, forcing a smile. "I've lived a quiet life." Christina tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps," she said lightly, but her eyes told another story. The meal concluded with polite farewells and promises to see one another again. Susan and Terry were escorted to the door by Ronald, who expressed his gratitude once more. As they stepped outside into the cool evening air, Susan exhaled deeply, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "Did you have fun, Grandma?" Terry asked, his eyes bright with the joy of the evening. Susan managed a small smile. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, though her voice wavered. "It was lovely." But as she glanced back at the illuminated windows of the Shelton estate, a shiver ran down her spine. She could feel Christina's lingering gaze, even from a distance, and the weight of the past pressed heavily on her. Inside, Christina stood by the window, her reflection superimposed over the darkened garden outside. Her mind raced, fragments of memory piecing together as she stared into the night. Susan wasn't a stranger. She knew that now. Christina's breath caught as the realization settled over her, sharp and undeniable. "It's her," she whispered. The sound of muffled footsteps echoed softly in the quiet corridor as Christina stepped away from the dining room. The evening's tension had been like a thin, fragile thread stretched between herself and Susan, and now it had finally snapped. The familiarity of Susan's face and the persistent sensation of her long-buried past resurfacing were irresistible to her. "Mrs. Susan," Christina said gently, her voice carrying down the hallway. Susan, who had been helping Terry adjust his jacket near the front door, turned slowly, her expression wary. "Yes," Susan replied, her voice steady but cautious. Christina gestured toward a quieter sitting room just off the hall. "May I have a word with you in private?" Susan glanced at Terry, who looked back at her with wide, questioning eyes. She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Go with Pamela for a moment, sweetheart. I'll just be a minute." Reluctantly, Terry nodded and followed Pamela back toward the dining room, leaving Susan and Christina alone. The room Christina led her to was modest compared to the grandeur of the rest of the estate, with a small fireplace and worn armchairs that seemed more lived in. Christina closed the door behind them, her hands clasped tightly together as she turned to face Susan. For a moment, neither spoke. The weight of the silence pressed down on them like an unspoken accusation. "I know who you are," Christina began, her voice breaking the stillness. "I've spent the evening trying to place your face, and now I'm certain." Susan stood frozen, her grip tightening on the shawl draped over her shoulders. I'm not sure what you mean." "You worked here," Christina said, her tone softening as her sharp gaze met Susan's. "Years ago, when Russell was still alive." The mention of Russell's name struck Susan with a forceful impact. Her composure faltered, and she took a shaky breath, the memories she had tried so hard to suppress rushing back. "Yes," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I worked here." Christina took a step closer, her expression a mixture of sorrow and regret. "You left Suddenly. I never understood why, until now. Susan's jaw tightened, the pain she had carried for years threatening to spill over. You didn't just not understand, Mrs. Shelton. You sent me away. You threw me out. Christina recoiled as the words struck her sharply. She stopped herself, her hand rising to cover her mouth as her emotions threatened to overwhelm her. I didn't know the truth back then. I only knew what Russell told me, that you seduced him. And I acted out of fear. Susan let out a bitter laugh. Fear? I found myself on my own, pregnant and alone. Christina's eyes widened. Your child, she whispered, the name falling from her lips like a revelation. She was yours. Emma, Susan said, her voice trembling. And you let us go without a second thought. Tears welled in Christina's eyes, and she sank into one of the armchairs, her hands trembling. I was indiscriminate, Susan. I see that now. I should have stood by you. I should have protected you. Susan's shoulders sagged, the anger she had carried for years giving way to exhaustion. You didn't. And Emma, she deserved better than what I could give her. She deserved a life free of struggle. Emma, Christina's voice broke. What happened to her? Susan looked away, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames in the fireplace. She passed away when she was just 25. An illness I couldn't afford to treat in time. The room fell silent, the weight of Susan's words sinking deep. Christina covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as tears spilled down her cheeks. I'm so sorry, she choked out. For everything. At that moment, the door creaked open, and Ronald stepped in. He paused, his eyes moving between the two women, sensing the tension in the room. What's going on? He asked carefully. Susan straightened, her voice steady, but thick with emotion. Your mother and I were discussing the past, and it seems you have a nephew, Mr. Shelton. Ronald's brow furrowed in confusion. What are you saying? Susan looked him in the eye, her chin lifting slightly. Terry, he's your blood. Emma was your half-sister. Your father abused me when I worked here. I was only 20 that year. Ronald's face paled, and he lowered himself into a chair as the revelation settled over him. I didn't know, he said quietly. I had no idea. Of course you didn't, Susan replied. You were young, studying abroad. Why would anyone tell you about the mistakes your father left behind? Silence enveloped the room as the gravity of the truth weighed on them all. Finally, Christina broke it, her voice trembling. Susan, please, let us make it right. Let us take care of Terry and give him the life Emma would have wanted. Susan's lips pressed into a thin line, her emotions warring within her. I appreciate your words, Christina, but Terry and I have our own life. It may not be much, but it's ours. But he's family, Ronald interjected, his voice firm but imploring. Susan met his gaze, her expression resolute. Family isn't just blood, Mr. Shelton. It's what you build together. Terry and I, we've built ours. Susan turned toward the door, her steps deliberate, but the weight of the conversation lingered heavily. Thank you for dinner, she said softly, her voice carrying a note of finality. But we'll be going now. The following afternoon, the quiet of Susan's modest home was interrupted by the soft rumble of Ronald's car pulling into the driveway. Terry, sitting at the small kitchen table, perked up as Pamela's cheerful face appeared through the car window. He dashed to the door, throwing it open before Susan could even untie her apron. They're here, Terry called, his voice brimming with excitement. Susan followed him to the door, her steps slower, her expression wary. She opened it to find Ronald stepping out of the car, carrying a basket of fresh fruits, while Pamela skipped toward the house with an armful of books. Good afternoon, Mrs. Susan, Ronald greeted with his usual composure. "I hope this isn't an inconvenient time." Susan glanced at Terry, who was already grinning as Pamela handed him one of the books. "Come in," she said finally, her tone polite but reserved. The small house felt even smaller with the addition of their visitors. Pamela and Terry quickly settled at the table, the books spread out before them as they exchanged animated whispers about schoolwork. Susan poured tea for Ronald and Christina, who had followed them in more hesitantly, her face reflecting a mixture of apprehension and hope. Christina was the first to speak. "Thank you for letting us visit," she began, her voice soft but earnest. "I wanted to apologize again for everything." Susan set the teapot down carefully, her hands steady despite the storm of emotions the words stirred. "I appreciate your apology, Mrs. Shelton," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "But that was a long time ago. Terry and I have moved on. I don't think Emma is angry either." Christina nodded, her eyes glistening. "I understand, but I still regret the pain I caused you." Across the room, Ronald's gaze shifted to the children. Pamela was explaining something with exaggerated hand gestures, while Terry listened intently, his face lit with admiration. Ronald's lips curved into a faint smile. "Susan," he said after a moment, turning his attention back to her, "there's something I need to say. Terry, he's family, my family, and I want you to know that I'm committed to his future. Whatever he needs, education, opportunities, anything, I want to help." Susan studied him carefully, her sharp eyes searching his face for sincerity. "He has what he needs," she said slowly. "But I won't stand in the way of you being part of his life, as long as it's what Terry wants." Ronald nodded. "Thank you. It means a lot to me. And to Pamela." Pamela, overhearing her name, looked up and beamed. "Terry's like my brother now," she declared. "We're going to study together and everything." Terry flushed, ducking his head, but there was a faint smile on his face. Susan watched the interaction quietly, her heart softening as she saw the bond forming between the two children. Christina, who had been silent for a moment, cleared her throat. "Susan," she said gently, "if there's anything we can do for you, please don't hesitate to ask. I owe you so much more than I can ever repay." Susan met her gaze, the weight of the years between them reflected in her eyes. "I'll keep that in mind," she said softly. As the afternoon wore on, the tension in the room slowly dissipated, replaced by the sound of laughter from the children and the hum of quiet conversation. Ronald watched his daughter and nephew, his nephew, and felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. The pieces of his fractured family were beginning to align, not perfectly, but enough to offer hope. Before they left, Ronald knelt beside Terry, his tone gentle but firm. "Terry, I want you to know something. I'm your uncle, and I'll always be here for you, no matter what." Terry looked at him, his dark eyes wide with surprise. "Uncle," he repeated, the word foreign, but not unwelcome. Ronald nodded. "Yes, you're part of this family, and that won't ever change." Terry hesitated before breaking into a small, shy smile. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet, but filled with sincerity. As the car pulled away, Susan stood on the porch, watching until it disappeared from view. She glanced at Terry, who was holding one of the books Pamela had brought, his face still lit with quiet joy. For the first time in a long while, she felt the faintest glimmer of something she hadn't dared to hope for. Peace. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting golden hues across Susan's modest garden. The once overgrown patch now bore small signs of care. Neatly trimmed hedges, rows of cheerful marigolds, and a scattering of wild daisies Terry had planted with Pamela's encouragement. The air was warm, filled with the gentle hum of crickets and the occasional burst of laughter from the children. Terry and Pamela darted between the rows of flowers, their game of tag spilling across the yard. Pamela's laughter rang out as Terry narrowly missed grabbing her hand, the sound light and infectious. Susan, seated on a wicker chair near the porch, watched them with a soft smile. Beside her, Christina sipped from a steaming cup of tea, her usually composed face relaxed as she took in the scene. "They seem happy," Christina said, her voice low, almost as if speaking too loudly might disturb the moment. "They are," Susan replied, her tone reflective. They found something in each other that neither of them had before. Christina nodded, her gaze distant. "I envy them. To be so free, so unburdened. I wish I could give back the years I took from you, Susan." "From Emma." Susan turned to her, her expression unreadable for a moment before softening. "The past can't be changed, Christina. But we're here now. That's what matters." At the edge of the garden, Ronald stood, his jacket slung over one shoulder, watching the children play. Their laughter carried across the yard, a stark contrast to the somber reflection etched on his face. He felt a hand on his arm and turned to see Susan, her eyes searching his. "You've done well by them," Susan said quietly, gesturing toward Pamela and Terry. "For everything that's happened, they've found something good." "I've learned more from them than they'll ever know," Ronald admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "They've shown me what family really means, what it should have meant all along." Pamela, breathless from the chase, flopped onto the grass, pulling Terry down beside her. "You're getting faster," she teased, nudging him with her elbow. Terry grinned, his face flushed from exertion. "You're just slow." "I'm not," she shot back, laughing as she lightly shoved him. Watching them, Ronald turned to Susan. "I want you to know, no matter what, Terry will always have a place with us. He's family." Susan nodded slowly, the depth of her gratitude reflected in her eyes. "I believe you, Ronald, and I'm thankful." As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard, the group gathered on the porch. Pamela leaned against her father, her eyelids drooping, while Terry sat beside Susan, his head resting against her arm. The golden light bathed them all, and for a moment, everything felt perfectly still. "This," Christina said softly, breaking the silence, "this is what Emma would have wanted. For us to be here, together." Susan looked out over the garden, her eyes glistening. "She would have loved it," she whispered. The children's laughter, now softer, lingered in the air like a melody carried by the wind. Ronald reached out, placing a hand gently on Terry's shoulder. Terry looked up, his gaze meeting his uncle's, and in that moment, no words were needed. As the final rays of sunlight faded, the warmth of their newfound family remained, a quiet promise of hope and healing. The evening closed, not with grand gestures or declarations, but with the simple, joyful sound of children's laughter, a sound that spoke of brighter days to come. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining.